So last class, at least in one of the small group meetings, somebody asked about different types of numerals. And there are different types. There are the old style numerals, or numerals that have varying heights and widths, just like normal characters of the alphabet. And then there are these lining numerals that all have the same x height and are all based off of the same width. Either one can be acceptable in your text. It just depends on the way you want your text to look or the purpose of whatever project you're working on. Generally speaking, when it comes to using these numerals in a large body of text, you'll see that the old style figures, they tend to fall at the x height of all the other lowercase letters. So in a way, they will read more like just part of the text. The issue, though, is that some of the numbers have descenders, some have ascenders, so they don't create nice blocks of text. Whereas the lining numerals, since they all have the same cap height, they create really nice straight lines of text. These lining numerals, you usually would use them for things like lists. So like these examples down here, something like stock numbers or maybe phone numbers on a business card, numbers in a phone book, something like that. You might consider using the lining numerals. The old style ones, usually you'll see that either with large blocks of text or in any situation where somebody wants to kind of harken back to an older time period or go with a more classic use of typography. But not all typefaces will have the lining and non-lining numerals. You'll have to actually go into InDesign and check. So one of the ways to do that is to pull up, I guess there's a couple ways. One way is if you choose the typeface, a normal set of type, and then it'll have a numeral variation. And let me see if any of these on here have one. Nope. So let's say something like Times New Roman, they might have a separate Times New Roman numerals. And so that would have the different types of numeral figures that you could choose from. The other way you can see if there's other number options is to pull up the glyphs menu. And if you don't already have that, you can go to Window and go down to Type and Tables and Glyphs. So this shows you all of the characters in that entire font set. And sometimes it'll have a special section for numerals. And like in this example, they're all at the lining numeral height. So those are the only options I have for this typeface. But if you're interested in using those, you just have to do some research and find the typeface that has those old style figures that you would prefer to have. All right, punctuation. I talked about this a little bit last week. There's a lot of confusion about what punctuation we use in certain situations. The biggest issue has to do with tick marks or hatch marks and quote marks. Quotes are rounded and they denote something that's said, so obviously a quote. whereas the tick marks will be used for units of measurement. So, for example, when you're talking about 5 feet 2 inches, you would use the 1 tick mark to denote feet, 2 tick marks to denote inches. Alternatively, if you're using apostrophes or quotes, you need to actually use the curved quote marks. So for here, you have it is a contraction of the contraction of that is it's, so you need to use the apostrophe. So down here are some examples of, so these are supposed to be using apostrophes, but all of these examples are using the tick marks. Whereas this example is using the correct apostrophe. This example is supposed to have 2 tick marks because it's supposed to be talking about inches. They mistakenly used the quote marks. So something that as a designer you really need to be aware of. Now going along with quotation marks, when I first started talking about InDesign, I mentioned hanging quotes. And so this is kind of showing an example of it. When you have quotes at the beginning of a line or a paragraph, if you don't adjust the way the quotes hang, you get this kind of weird white space at the beginning of the line, and you don't want that to happen. So instead, you'd want to do hanging punctuation, and this goes for your body text or for call-outs or other types of blocks of text. And on thinkingwithtype.com, Ellen Lupton talks about different ways to do it. I mentioned before, if I have some quotes in a text, right now that quote is just inside of the normal text block, but I want it to shift out. So what I'm going to do is go and pull up my optical alignment under story. So if I check that, it's going to adjust everything so it looks like the quotes are not creating that weird white space next to the first letter of that sentence. Other things you could do, you could play with the tabs and indent the text in different ways. So I could adjust the indents. You do that under paragraph. There's some other tricks too that are mentioned on the website. But as far as the quotes go, to make sure you're using the right stuff, what I would recommend from the beginning is going to Preferences and go down to Type and make sure that Typographer's Quotes is selected. So that time, anytime you press the single quote or double quote button on the keyboard, it's going to automatically give you the curly quotes. Other ways to get those quote marks are to go to Type, Insert Special Character, and Quotation Marks. And so it'll spell out what you're inserting. And go to Punctuation and you can find the proper quote marks. If you do the option to automatically put in the typographer's quotes, then anytime you need tick marks, you'd have to actually put those in yourself. So you could either go to the Type menu up here and go to Special Character, or same deal, you can go to the glyphs and choose the tick marks to put in. All right, so further down in this website, it has these special key commands for inserting other types of punctuation. We talked about the quotes already. One thing that people probably use a lot less often than quotes, but is still pretty important, are dashes, N dashes, and M dashes. If I go back over here, a lot of times when people want to say like 10 o'clock a.m. to 2 o'clock p.m., they just automatically put a hyphen in there because it's some form of a dash. There's actually a certain type of dash that you should use in those situations. The hyphen is usually used to combine two words. So if you've got a compound word, you would use the hyphen to connect those two words. You'll also use it when you're at the end of a line of type and it gets moved over to the next line. So this character right here would be a hyphen. But when you want to say, let's see, the party was from 3 to 5 p.m. What I want to use to replace the 2 is not a hyphen. What I want to use is an N dash, E-N. And that refers to actually metal spacing used in letterpress. So the M dash refers to the spacing of, usually I think it goes along with the space of the capital N in the type case. So it's actually something that varies depending on the typeface you're using. So the width of one capital N is an N dash. The N dash is used anytime you want to say to or till. So to insert that, same deal as before. You go to type, insert special characters, and go to hyphens and dashes. And since I'm wanting to replace the word to, I'm going to use N dash, and it'll put that in. Now when you use an N dash, you don't necessarily have to put spaces on either side of it, but you may want to adjust the kerning to give a little bit more breathing room to it. Yeah.
Is there a way that you can bind that to your keyboard, like the index?
If you go to thinkingwithtype.com, she has a bunch of key commands. So for the N dash, it's option hyphen. And the more you use it, it'll become second nature. So that's one way to do it. There's a key command, and then like with everything else, you can go to the glyphs menu and find the N dash and insert it that way. Now let's say I've got a sentence and it gets broken up. I'm kind of introducing another thought into it. That's when I'd use something called the M dash EM. And the M dash is based off of the width of the capital letter M in letterpress. So it's wider than the N dash. It's similar to using parentheses inside of a sentence, where you are kind of adding on to what's inside a sentence, but if you don't kind of separate it, it won't make any sense. So let me think. Okay, so I've got a sentence here. I went to the store, a place on the other side of town, to get some beef stew. Right now I've got commas separating the idea, the extra information, which is a place on the other side of town. But just having the commas there, it kind of affects the flow of the sentence, and it seems like I'm kind of going off in a weird tangent and not understanding, not getting the point across that I want. So this is a good instance for an M dash. So same thing with the hyphen, the M, N dash. I can put it in there 3 different ways. I use them a lot, so it's Shift, Command, hyphen, and for some reason it's not putting it in there. But for this, I use an M dash at each comma and put it in. So now it's breaking up that sentence. It's letting the reader know this is a kind of a tangent, but I'm going to come back and resolve what I was saying before. Like I was saying with the N dash, you don't have to have spaces before and after these dashes, but you might want to go and adjust some of the tracking before and after it. So I could put some spaces in front or behind it just so the line isn't too close to the other letters. Are there any questions about the dashes? Because it can get kind of confusing. The most important one, and the one that people get confused most often, is the N dash. So just remember, anytime you're saying to or till, you need to use the N dash. All right, some of these other characters, I guess the only one that kind of relates to you guys for this project would be the ellipses, and those are used anytime you are either have a thought that kind of trails off, or you're taking out a section of the original text. So if, for example, I've got, let's say this whole paragraph is a quote, and there's a bunch of stuff that I'm going to cut out in that area. Since I'm cutting out just a center part of that, I'm going to put in ellipses so that the reader understands that there's more text there. I just haven't put it in. So once again, there's key commands for it, or go to insert special characters, and the ellipses are under symbols, and it'll put in the 3 periods. If you're going to use these, you want to use a special character, because these are specially formatted to work with your typeface. So the spacing between those 3 dots is created by the typographer. If you just use 3 periods, you're going to have to go back and adjust the spacing between each one. It's going to be a pain in the ass. So definitely check out the special character area. If you need to put in copyright symbols or some other special characters, it's a good place to look. What else was I going to talk about? Oh, another thing I wanted to mention to you guys, especially as you're working on your body text. With the last class, you guys were thinking about general grid structures to use, how many columns you're going to have, where images are going to fall. One thing that I want you guys to keep in mind is once you establish the grid, you can always make some adjustments and play with it. So I'm not saying this is something you have to do, but you can start to think about blocks of text as images on a page, and how those blocks of text work with the entire composition of a spread. So for instance, yeah, I could have these 3 really long columns of text, or maybe I can adjust these columns based off of my grid. So maybe I draw down a guide and have all of the text on this page work from that baseline. Maybe I carry that guideline over here and I use the space at the bottom to either continue the text, or maybe this becomes some sidebars or additional information. And then this larger space at the top and let's see, since this bottom part is looking kind of weird, maybe I decide down here that I'm going to have some other information that pertains to the article but is kind of a sidebar. But I could bring in some guides and define gutters and margins on a horizontal basis. Bring my image down. So I've still got my 3 columns, but it's just different ways of working with it. Maybe I'm talking about sound and movement, so I really want some of these columns to have different upper lines too. And so this does interesting things with the white space above it. So think about the whole composition that the spread makes. You know, the way this is set up is kind of playing off of what I've done with the cropping of the image. So you don't necessarily have to stick with these big blocks of text going from top to bottom in each column. You can vary things. Take a look at your magazine and see if they do anything like that. If they don't, maybe you decide to experiment a little bit. Just like with some of the previous projects, as you're doing thumbnails, you know, you could have a couple versions that are completely ridiculous and you think might be pushing it too far, and then have other ones that are more conservative and would fit really well within the magazine. And what you'll end up with in the end might be something that's a nice mix between the two. Any questions about anything else? Any questions about stuff in InDesign? So when you get ready to print this stuff, you've got 2 main options. One option is to package your file. If you package the file, it's going to put together all of the fonts and colors and everything you've used in your document into its own folder, so you can take that and put it onto another computer to print. So to do that, you'll go to File and Package. And when you go over here, you'll get a summary. It'll tell you the fonts, the images, colors used, etc. I would say even if you don't package your file, you should do this, because it's going to tell you what images, or if you have any images that are in RGB. So check this, and if it says you have images in RGB, go back and check and make sure you're using the right color profile. It'll also show you the fonts you have in your document. So, yeah, as you're using it, the inks will show you whether or not you're using RGB or 4-color process, which is CMYK, or Pantone. For this project, you're just going to stick with CMYK. And once you've checked all of that and everything's good to go, you'll hit Package. You can fill this out if you want to. Really, you just need to name it something so you know what it is. And it'll put everything into a folder. And this comes up just saying that with fonts, they're usually licensed, and are you aware that you're sending it to somebody else, and blah, blah, blah. Just press OK. And then you should have that file you'll get a folder with that file. So the original InDesign document, links, which are all of the photos or images you have in your document, and then the fonts that are associated with it. The reason this would be done is so when you send it to a printer in a different building, a different county, different state, whatever, they have everything they need to be able to print off the document. If you just sent them the InDesign file and nothing else, they wouldn't be able to print the fonts unless they already had them on their computer, and they wouldn't be able to print the images because they don't have them. So this is an easy way to get everything they need into one folder. So this is one thing to do. If you do this to print, you need to make sure you take this whole folder over to the computer and keep that document there. Otherwise, your InDesign file won't know where to look for the stuff. The other option, which is probably what most of you guys will do, is to export this as a PDF. So when you do that, change it to print. And for you guys to print and trim these out, you're probably going to want to print separate pages. So you can print spreads. I'm going to tell you guys to go ahead and print pages, and you'll have to put them together on the boards. So don't choose spreads, but just know that that's an option. When you go to marks and bleeds, the most important thing is to have crop marks. And make sure that you have your bleed selected. So if you have anything going off to the edge of the page, you get a nice clean cut when you go to trim it. So when this is done, I've got all of my pages separate, and I have these crop marks so I can trim them down. I'll talk to you guys closer to the end of the project, which I guess would be next week, about how you would trim these down and mount them onto your boards. But especially since with the magazines, they tend to be larger pages, this is why you'd want them to be on separate sheets of paper. So if you have to, you can print these out on tabloid sheets and then trim them down and kind of butt them up once against one another to make a full spread. All right. Any other questions? No? All right.